Hi, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us here today. My name is Caitlin, and I'm the Communications Manager for the Pediatric Cancer Data Commons, or Pcbc. This talk today is the second event in our guest speaker series, The Common Good. The purpose of this series is to invite thought leaders from across the fields of pediatric oncology, data sharing, and international collaboration to share their big ideas and what they see as opportunities for change in the hopes that we can all learn from each other and work together toward the common good. We are recording these talks and we're gathering them on our website, the PCDC website. So if you missed our first event last October, that talk from Greg Simon is available there. If you want to share this talk today with colleagues later, we'll be adding that soon, and I'll include that link in a follow-up email to everyone here. We're so excited and honored to have Dr. Sam Blackman with us today to talk about his experience with pediatric oncology drug development. There will be time for Q&A at the end of the talk, so please use the Q&A function in the bottom bar of your Zoom screen to enter your questions at any time during the talk, and we'll address them at the end. And with that, I'll hand it off to pediatric oncologist and director of the PCDC, Sam Volchenbaum.
Great. Thanks, Caitlin. So I'm super excited to introduce Sam Blackman, and we've been colleagues and friends for a very long time. The pace of pediatric drug development has been something that Sam and I have been talking about for over 20 years now. And to hear him talk about his journey and the work that he's doing is just incredibly exciting. Sam's an alum of the University of Chicago and then got his MD PhD at UIC. He followed me to Cincinnati Children's Hospital, where we were both residents, and then followed me again to Boston, where we were fellows together at Dana-Farber and Boston Children's. But then our paths diverged, and Sam did a very smart thing, and he went the route of going to work at for various drug development companies, and spent some time at the big guys, Merck and GSK, and then got into really working on bespoke drug developing for pediatric cancer. And for instance, at Juno, he led their CAR T-cell program and has had varying levels of varying successes working with these companies on developing drugs specifically for pediatric cancer, which if you had told somebody that to do that 20 years ago, they would have looked at you funny. And now Sam has based an entire, I'll say like an empire on it. I mean, it's really amazing what Sam has built. And so when Sam came, when I saw Sam, and I think it was it 2018 or so at the Biden moonshot talk, Sam said, "Hey, listen, I'm thinking about starting a new company, and we're going to base it on pediatric drug development. Our hope is that in 2-3 years we'll have a drug to market." I was like, "This is ludicrous. You know, why would I believe that?" And then I forgot it was Sam Blackman. So of course, Sam has founded Day One Pharmaceuticals and is their chief medical officer, and has just done an incredible job. And not a day goes by that I'm not jealous seeing something else that he's accomplished. This one really made me spill my coffee, which was seeing Sam ring the bell at the NASDAQ when their company went public a few months ago. So just incredible career that he's had. And I'm so excited that he's here to talk with us. And I think we're going to learn a lot today about the world of pediatric drug development and where we're going. The title of Sam's talk is Putting Children First, New Models for Pediatric Oncology Drug Development. And I will stop sharing and hand it over to you, Sam.
Great, thank you. Let's see, do this and that and this. Well, first off, Sam, always great to see you. And I will tell the broader audience, as I was telling Caitlin before, that when I started my residency, it took about a month, and then somebody started telling me that I reminded them so much of Sam Volchenbaum, which I had having no idea who that was at the time. I was completely and totally confused, but now in retrospect recognize that that was an incredible compliment. So thank you for letting me share some thoughts today, Sam, and good morning and afternoon to everybody here. I'm going to talk about new models for pediatric oncology drug development. I'm obviously going to borrow heavily from the experience that I've had over the past now 4 years building Day One Biopharmaceuticals, but I really want to talk more broadly about the landscape, because it's, Day One in and of itself is is something of an experiment and one that I think appears to be succeeding. But clearly, there's a lot more work to go to try to bring parity and equity to children with cancer so that they can benefit from the revolution in cancer therapeutic development that we've all been living through for the past 10 or 15 years. Because Day One is a publicly traded biotechnology company, I have to show you this disclaimer slide, which I'm not going to do anything other than to just tell you that that there's a lot of disclaimers that come from being a public company. I'm going to briefly have on the slide references to two of our programs, Day 101 or tovorafenib and pimasertib. These are investigational compounds, and the safety and efficacy have not yet been established, and there's no guarantee that these drugs will be approved or become commercially available. And then finally, I think it's important to say that this talk really represents my individual views. I'm speaking to you today as an individual and not on behalf of the company. And then just for financial disclosure, I am a shareholder and obviously an employee of Day One. Okay, with that out of the way, I do want to talk about new models for pediatric cancer drug development. And when I was thinking about how to structure this talk, I decided to use sort of the journalistic paradigm of, sort of who, what, when, where, why, and how, but maybe just adapt it a little more for the topic at hand. So the first is really going to be a why. Why do we need new models for pediatric oncology drug development? And I want to take a moment to just reflect on what we know about the pace of cancer drug development for children and where the gaps and shortcomings are. And then I want to tell you a little bit about how we as a group, this is out of a European consortium called Accelerate, started thinking about how we should build new models or a new model for childhood cancer drug development. I'll tell you a little bit about what we managed to build, and this is really going from that working group at Accelerate to Day One, and then some thoughts on what comes next in order to best serve the needs of the children that we care so much about. And then we'll have some time for questions. Okay, so why do we need a new model? This paper, I think, which was published by my former fellowship classmate, Steve Du Bois, and actually David Schulman, who was a summer student of mine when I was doing a postdoc, was published in 2019 in the European Journal of Cancer and highlighted something that I think that we've all known, but they managed to quantify nicely, which is that there's an unacceptably long lag between the start of first in human or first in adult and first in child clinical trials. We have been going through a real revolution in cancer therapeutic development. We've transcended chemotherapy. We've got thousands, literally thousands of small molecule signal transduction inhibitors in development. We've got both simple and complex biologics ranging from monoclonal antibodies to antibody drug conjugates to CAR T-cell therapies and all sorts of new modalities that are primarily directed at addressing the vast population of adult cancers, breast cancer, colon cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer, and the like. But the targets of these cancer therapeutics oftentimes overlap with targets that are relevant to pediatric cancers. And you would think that in this era of targeted therapy, we certainly should simultaneously begin pediatric oncology trials where the target for the drug is relevant to both pediatric and adult cancers, but we don't for a variety of reasons that I'll touch on momentarily. I'm going to tell you the punchline first is that there's a median of a 6.5-year gap between the start of first in human trials for adults and the start of first in child clinical trials. And if you look at the graph in the bottom left, you can see that that is truly a median, and everything to the right are delays of longer and sometimes far longer than 6.5 years. And this is only for FDA approved oncology drugs. This doesn't include drugs that are currently in development. And if you look at the right, it really illustrates, I think, or puts numbers around the size of this gap. These pie charts represent phase 1 trials started in children, adults, or mixed populations of children and adults for 2 generations of cancer drug development, the time from 1998 to 2007 and from 2008 to 2017. And I want you to really focus on the green slivers of the chart, which you can barely see because they represent less than 1% of clinical trials that are specific only to children. And that is clearly insufficient given the number of new cancer therapeutics in development. Here's another way of looking at this remarkable disparity. We're seeing this massive wave of innovation that the benefits are clearly not extending to children. If you take, and this is a slide that I made about 3 years ago, just looking at kinase inhibitors that have been approved for use in adult cancer between the period of about 2008 and 2018 and 2019. To date, this is back in 3 years ago, 48 were approved for use in adults, only 3 kinase inhibitors approved for use in children. And if you go down the list of checkpoint inhibitors, antibody drug conjugates, and CAR T cells and bispecific T cell engagers, again, it's typically a fraction of these that have been approved for use in children where there's been an approval for use in adults. The notable difference, of course, is at the bottom, CAR T cells, because CAR T cell development started with a focus on CD19, which is the antigen that defines B-cell acute lymphoblastic leukemia. And that disease is really the most common cancer of childhood, which is why that's been a notable exception. But there are far fewer CAR T cell programs than there are kinase inhibitor programs and checkpoint inhibitor programs. So again, we have this yawning disparity. Drilling down even further, focusing on a single disease like AML, this is a hematologic malignancy that has been recalcitrant to many, many therapies. In fact, even today, most patients get high-dose chemotherapy for their induction and no application of targeted therapies. But in the past 4 or 5 years, we've seen quite a surge of new therapies for AML. And even though AML is about 1/3 of pediatric leukemia, we've seen only one drug and a much older drug approved for children. So the drugs that address FLT3 internal tandem duplications and FLT3 mutations, IDH1, IDH2 mutations, they have been approved for adults with AML with these mutations, but not for children, despite the fact that FLT3 alterations occur in about 15% of pediatric AML, which is not far off from the proportion that you see in adult AML, and IDH mutations occur in a defined population of AML. Again, it's smaller than what you see with adults, but an addressable population nevertheless. So, I hope I've convinced you that despite the fact that we're getting more and more precise with our ability to target cancer, and that the targets that we're able to drug are relevant to pediatric cancers, children still do not get drugs developed for them with the same degree of urgency as adults do. So why is this? Well, I've been in the biopharmaceutical industry for about 15 years, and there is some dogma about development of drugs in children that I think is outdated. And these are maybe not necessarily direct quotations from people as implied by the comment bubbles here, but they are sentiments held and expressed. And these are things that I have heard along the way as I and many of my other pediatric oncology colleagues in industry have tried to drive programs forward into childhood cancer. We'll hear that the trials take too long because the population sizes are so small, or there's questions around regulatory issues that slow down the initiation of trials, or the population is simply too hard to access, or drug development is too expensive and small populations aren't profitable. Or my favorite, which is the myth that if a child suffered an adverse event on a pediatric clinical trial, it would doom an adult development program. And I think many of these things are no longer valid. We're in an era where clinical trial sites, I think, are certainly more enlightened, and certainly where regulatory agencies are more enlightened and are not willing to, if you will, throw the baby out with the bathwater. Should there be challenges with developing a drug in children, it doesn't mean that the drug is invalid. It just means that we need to be thoughtful about how we develop them in children. So this dogma, I think, is outdated and needs to be questioned. In fact, and this is really a summary of experiences that I had when I was working on pediatric drug development at companies like Merck and Glaxo, the ecosystem of pediatric oncology today has become so sophisticated that pediatric studies can be executed at the speed of biotech. It used to be that there were real decelerators, and I do want to, to be honest and say that that dogma was founded on, I think, accurate observations. When the Children's Oncology Group, or before that, the POG and CCG, were really the only two cooperative groups, these narrow, or a narrower number of consortia really limited the opportunities for doing multi-center clinical trials. It used to be that there was not great cooperation between US and ex-US clinical trial sites, meaning that we'd have to run your trials within a single geography. There were many Me Too programs, and it was really hard to prioritize what drugs should be taken into pediatric patients. Now I think that there are true accelerators that enable pediatric cancer drug development for children. There are adaptive trial designs, cooperation around the world to allow for global enrollment of pediatric patients. Many academic pediatric oncology sites have worked with industry and know how to execute those trials. And we have evidence of target activity relevant in adult population and a better understanding of pediatric cancer biology that allows us to move new drugs faster into defined populations in children where there's positive benefit to risk ratio. And if you look at the bottom, there's real evidence of this. Selumetinib, the MEK inhibitor, was tested in pediatric patients with plexiform neurofibroma that's inoperable and accrued 50 patients to that trial in a single year. That's pretty darn rapid, even for an adult oncology trial. Binimetinib enrolled 46 patients in 11 months into a phase 2 low-grade glioma trial. Larotrectinib, the NTRK inhibitor, enrolled 24 patients, pediatric patients, in 17 months. And this is a very young group of patients with a median age of 4.5 years. So it can be done. And I think it needs to be done. And what we really need is, a company or group of companies that are heavily invested in taking advantage of this refined environment. I think another thing that lends towards more pediatric cancer drug development are the regulatory incentives. If you want to file your adult drug in Europe, you now, and as it's been for the past almost 15 years, need to have a European Medicines Association approved pediatric investigation plan. And in the United States, if you're developing a drug for which the target is relevant, an adult drug for which the target is relevant in a pediatric cancer, you have to have an approved pediatric study plan from the FDA. So there are regulatory incentives to do this. There are regulatory mandates to do this. They're incomplete incentives, but they do provide, I think, some additional tailwinds to companies that should maybe not so much force them, but drive them to think about pediatric oncology drug development as early as possible. And then the last point that I want to make on this before sort of getting into the, you've defined the problem and a potential solution, what did you do about it, is just to show you that as we define adult cancers more and more narrowly, one of the things that I've observed is that smaller adult indications that support approval and commercialization approach the size of larger pediatric indications. And here are just 3 examples of drugs that have been approved in the past 3 or 4 years for rare adult oncology indications, where the numbers of patients are not terribly dissimilar to the numbers of patients for some common pediatric cancers. Drugs for a rare adult cancer called blastic plasmacytoid dendritic cell neoplasm. That's fewer than 1,000 patients per year. Hairy cell leukemia, which, by the way, we've cured like 4 different times, has recently had yet another immunoconjugate approved for it. That's about 11,000 patients per year. And epithelioid sarcoma, which is a rare, slow-growing soft tissue sarcoma in adults, is about 250 so cases per year and was the first approved indication for the EZH2 inhibitor tazemetostat. So there's clearly calculus within biotech companies for adult cancers of less than 1,000 patients per year. So why can't we make that model work for pediatric oncology? Okay, so this is the problem that I've been thinking about for a long time, not just myself. A lot of other people have been thinking about it. When Sam and I met at that Biden Cancer Initiative meeting, which, by the way, the previous speaker, Greg Simon, was at, there were many others there, and we talked about, what do we do from here? At the same time that the Biden Cancer Initiative was thinking about pediatric oncology, there was another group based out of Europe called Accelerate that had decided to stand up a working group focused on setting up new business models and ways to invest in pediatric oncology research and drug development. And I was asked to participate in this. This was a group that was composed of 4 patient advocates: Patricia Blanc, Delphine Heenan, Sam Dams, and Jean-Charles Vandenbranden. And then 4 industry and academic experts in pediatric oncology: myself, Raphael Rousseau, who was at the time at Gritstone, but before that had been at Genentech running their pediatric oncology drug development unit; Gilles Vassal from Gustave Roussy and Andy Pearson from the Royal Marsden and the Institute for Cancer Research. And we set our minds to essentially turning the cancer drug development model upside down. Currently, and historically, cancer drug development starts from the biology of adult oncology: colorectal cancer, lung cancer, prostate cancer, breast cancer, looking at those diseases, identifying and validating druggable targets, and then going out and making molecules to inhibit those targets or to modulate the biology of the disease through those targets. And then what ends up happening is there are hand-me-downs where that target may be relevant to a pediatric cancer, and you hope that one day that drug makes its way into pediatric clinical trials. And we decided if we're going to try to build a brand new enterprise, why don't we do this a little bit differently and think and start from children's needs and from the target biology of pediatric tumors. So why don't we look at the tumors that we know are most common drivers of pediatric cancers, and then try to find drugs that serve those diseases, and then find ways to extend those drugs to adult cancer subsets. And I think that as we continue to work on this model, it was pretty clear that if we could find a way to actually operationalize this, right, either create a drug or retarget a drug or cleave off the corporate rights to develop a drug from a company, that we could lead to significant value creation for all stakeholders. For example, let's say that we were to identify a company that was developing a really interesting drug for lung cancer, and that drug served a target that was relevant in a large pediatric indication. What if we went to that company and said, listen, you've got an obligation to develop this drug in children. The European Medicines Association says so, the FDA says so, but you're busy with your adult development program. Why don't you sell us the rights to develop that drug for children, and we'll do the pediatric work much, much faster. You'll have met your regulatory obligation. We'll help you get credit for that. And we'll make sure that the trials get run properly and they get run quickly. That is a case that we wanted to make to essentially the broader world of adult oncology drug development. What if we found a drug or a platform technology company that was developing a new modality, and we said, listen, there are certain cancers in children that are driven by a single genetic alteration. Think about all of the pediatric tumors driven by fusion oncoproteins. What if you could achieve faster proof of concept for your novel therapeutic modality by applying that to Ewing sarcoma or alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma, as opposed to myeloid leukemias or lung cancer or ovarian cancer, where you've got a number of other coincident genomic alterations? What if you tried to get to proof of concept in a cleaner disease setting? That could be of value to you, and it certainly could be of value to patients with that pediatric cancer. And then finally, what if we took a drug that was on the shelf, and I'll get back to why I hate that term, but a drug that had been deprioritized or discontinued, and found a new use for it in a pediatric indication? You've taken something with essentially zero value now and created value. And that would require identifying drugs for high value validated targets in pediatric cancers and going back and looking to find things that would serve them within the repertoire of existing or discontinued drugs. So, we had an array of different opportunities here, and now we had to figure out which one was going to allow us to stand up a company around it. A couple of other things that were important criteria for determining potential pipeline agents to build this or to seed this new company. We wanted to serve areas of unmet medical need. We wanted to help children not helped today. We wanted to identify programs where we had a high probability of getting health authority approval. And then we wanted to have something that would do this rapidly to reduce the time to commercialization, because at the end of the day, you want to build a sustainable enterprise. It needs to be something that people are willing to invest in. And for that, time is really of the essence. So we thought about a bunch of different ways of doing this. And at the time that Working Group 4 was up and running, Andrew Lo, who is a professor of economics at MIT, had published a really thought-provoking paper on whether or not financial engineering can cure cancer. And without getting into all of the details here, I would refer you to a second piece written by Andrew Lo, but also with Peter Adamson, former head of Children's Oncology Group, and Raphael Rousseau, that was published in JAMA Oncology on the application of a new business model based on Andrew Lo's portfolio theory to accelerate innovation in pediatric oncology. And briefly summarizing this, Andrew Lo hypothesized that a large portfolio of drugs, all of which had a modest probability of success, if you had 20 or so of these drugs and you had them all together and you could develop them, all you would need would be for 1 or 2 of them to work to provide the return on investment, because of the way that cancer drugs are priced and commercialized in the United States. So really what you would need to do is just acquire a large portfolio of low cost, deprioritized agents, and then find the right ways to develop them. And all you needed was 1 or 2 to work, and then you could re-up and find additional programs. So you would build these portfolios. So that's one really interesting model. Another model that we considered was a true not-for-profit model. And I think the best example of this is actually a company called M4K Pharma, or Medicines for Kids, which is trying to develop an ACVR1 inhibitor in an open source, not-for-profit model for patients with diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma. So certainly we thought about the not-for-profit model. And then of course there was the traditional biotech model where you repurposed a drug for pediatric oncology as well as adult oncology and created value that way. And I think the best example of this in recent times has been Loxo Oncology, that took an old NTRK inhibitor from Array that had failed in its trials for neuropathic pain, recognized that this drug could be useful for NTRK fusion-driven cancers, both adult and pediatric patients, developed it quickly in that space, and then showed that by putting the right drug in the right patients, you could generate a high response rate. And that led to not only the ability to build this company, but ultimately for them to sell this company to a much larger pharmaceutical partner. So we considered all of these, the not-for-profit model, including the venture philanthropy model, raising money from deeply committed pediatric oncology-based philanthropic organizations. The problem is these charities are small, and in the aggregate, they're oftentimes unable to raise the capital needed to truly move a program forward. And oftentimes, you're putting all of your eggs in one very risky basket. So that model was unsatisfying. Public-private partnerships, getting the government to come in and partner with a private company to develop drugs. A fascinating model given the budgets of government agencies and strong US federal agency interest in addressing the unmet needs of pediatric cancer patients, both from the NCI and the FDA. The challenges with this idea is that you need a champion within the federal government. And of course, as you know, government funding processes are complex. And even though there's bipartisan consensus around doing things for children with cancer, getting bipartisan action for anything these days is almost impossible. We looked at Andrew Lowe's portfolio model. There are opportunities with this because of the large number of deprioritized assets and the fact that a single success could offset the cost of multiple failures. The problem is that having a team that could handle a huge portfolio of drugs and move everything forward in a purposeful and meaningful manner requires raising a lot of capital to get that team and putting it upfront at risk. Where we landed was the idea of a traditional venture-backed for-profit biotech model. This is, more like the Loxo model. It's a traditional model familiar to many seed and Series A stage investors. This idea of spinning out an old asset from pharma and building a company around it to use the right drug in the right patient population. And by working with venture capital companies, you can tap their network of expertise to enable faster and better company formation. The challenges, of course, with the venture model is that you need to find something that attracts venture capital interest and investment. You need to convince them that there's a path to a return on their investment. And you need to be able to do this multiple times so that you're not just a one-trick pony, but you can actually create a company that it's got a repeatable process and is ultimately sustainable to solve the problem that you want to solve, which in our case is to be an accelerator for pediatric cancer therapeutic development. So with that in mind, Accelerate as an academic collaboration was not going to go and start a company. But I had time on my hands, so I figured, well, why don't we do this? And it was actually through the Biden Cancer Initiative work that a venture capitalist at Canaan Partners, Julie Grant, became very interested in trying to solve the same problem that I've been working on with the Accelerate group. And when she and I met, actually over a table where I was trying to raise money for another biotech company, we realized that we had this common interest, and that if we had the time, we should start working on this. And it turned out that we did. This is almost 4 years ago now. And in May or June of 2018, we set to work. And we thought about what it would take to actually build a pediatric oncology focused biotech company. This is a slide from one of our very earliest pitch decks, which was our guess at what a portfolio and set of timelines would look like if we were going to raise seed capital, go hunting for molecules, raise Series A money, raise Series B money, and try to move these programs forward in development. Couple of things from this. It's really to show you how long it takes to go from raising money and trying to identify drugs to actually being able to move forward to starting clinical trials. This timeline is about 5 years in length. And the other piece that I want to sort of highlight here are the expected capital demands to be able to move multiple programs forward in development. At the low end, it's about 60 or 70 million. And at the high end, you're talking about over $125 million. And this was our first guess. It turns out that the requirements are oftentimes higher than that. But it does take a lot of capital to be able to acquire programs, transfer them in, and build the team around it to move them forward in development. And that's even before you get to the external costs of running clinical trials and setting up manufacturing. So we were able to convince Canaan that we had a path to identifying high priority programs and that we could find them by looking at companies that were spinning out assets. And this happens all the time in oncology. You'll see programs that are paused because of a clinical failure for an adult oncology development, and the company may not be interested in creating a new hypothesis to retarget that drug. There are companies that oftentimes have more assets than they can afford to develop, so they will have a change in strategic priorities or a change in budget, and the drug might have zero clinical liabilities. It may actually be something that works, but they just can't justify the cost of development, and they'll look for external partners. And so the thought was, why don't we begin approaching all these companies, see what they have that's quote unquote on the shelf or is being deprioritized for strategic reasons, and where they might seek a partner. And this was just me and Julie Grant now at JP Morgan about 3 years ago, going out and having these conversations. We have, as one business development professional described us, a lot of mishigas coming to them and asking what programs we could take out of their hands for them. A couple of things that we learned along the way that I thought were really interesting. One is that there really is no shelf. People talk about taking drugs off the shelf. It turns out that much like in the Matrix, where there is no spoon, in drug companies, there is no shelf. Most of the time, if programs die, they are dead. And this is because when a program dies or is terminated in a large pharmaceutical company, over not many years, the team disbands, so the internal institutional knowledge diffuses. Companies may stop manufacturing, or they may no longer be maintaining drugs on stability. So you run out of actual clinical trial material, which means to resynthesize that drug and test it could require many millions of dollars. The other issue is that companies oftentimes don't have large efforts dedicated to out-licensing deprioritized molecules. They may not have access to the material, or the material may not be publicly available. They simply don't see the financial upside in selling something to someone for very little in the hopes that maybe you'll be able to get some return on it later. They're much more interested in licensing things that could make their companies a lot of money. And when they do find something that they're willing to out-license, and you think it's a value, then they think it's a value, which means they're going to want money for it on the front end, which means you need to come to them with a large check in hand. This gets to something called, this gets to something that's part of the law of unintended consequences. When we approach a company with about a discontinued program of theirs, and we say that we're interested in it, their perception of the value for that program goes up. Even though we haven't done anything, just by looking at the program, we've changed the value. It's like a variation of the Heisenberg uncertainty principle. And the reason for this is something that I've called Loxo-FOMO. When Array licensed out larotrectinib to Loxo, they gave it away to them for a prayer. I mean, single-digit millions, maybe even double-digit millions at the most. But then Loxo was able to take that drug and build it into a successful drug development program, which resulted in Loxo being acquired by Eli Lilly for $8 billion. So whoever at Array out-licensed larotrectinib to Loxo for whatever, 10 million bucks, basically gave away something that ultimately was worth $8 billion. And that person, of course, doesn't want to make that mistake again. And most business development people don't want to make that mistake again either. Nobody wants to miss out on potentially selling the next Loxo Oncology. So we learned a lot about business development. We also learned a lot about capital demands and what the true cost of drug development is. We calculated it as being about $20 to $50 million to value inflection for a program that was already in the clinic, and typically over $100 million to get to drug approval for pediatric oncology. And the main drivers of these costs are running clinical trials, building a dedicated team, setting up for commercialization and distribution, as well as manufacturing infrastructure. So we knew what it was going to cost, which meant that we would have to find something that with those costs would still generate a meaningful return on investment for our investors at a time when competition for investment dollars was high. And not only would we have to do it once, we'd have to do it repeatedly to prove that not only did our program work, but the overall business model would work. So despite all these challenges, we decided to take this on. And Canaan was very generous. They gave us a couple of $1 million as seed capital and let us go out to try to find a program. So we incorporated a company on October 1st, actually, or November 1st, sorry, of 2018. And we called it Day One Biopharmaceuticals. We named this after a paper that was published by Jenny Mack and Holcomb Greer at the Dana-Farber Boston Children's Program in 2004 called the Day One Talk, which is the discussion that you have with patients and their families when a child is diagnosed with cancer. And it lays out what the treatment plan is, it lays out what the diagnosis is, it lays out the risks and benefits. And the purpose is really to build that therapeutic relationship between the oncologist and the patient and their family. And it also represents really the day one of this next phase of this family's life and the treatment of their child. And we thought, well, couldn't think of anything more poetic to call a company where we hoped not only for our company to be the first, this to be the day one of a new model for pediatric cancer drug development, but also we wanted to provide new medicines for doctors to have at that day one talk. And not long thereafter, we were able to identify a drug that was being out-licensed by Takeda that they had previously gotten from a company called Sunesis. This is a drug called TAC-580. It's now known as Day 101 or tovorafenib, and it's an oral brain-penetrant pan-RAF inhibitor that we know could be targeted or retargeted for use in children with relapsed low-grade glioma with BRAF alterations. We spent the better part of 9 or 10 months diligencing this molecule and working on deal parameters with Takeda, and we're able then to go out and turn to raising money, and we're able to raise $60 million in our Series A round from 3 venture capital firms to support the initial development of this molecule. And we spent the better part of 2020 designing clinical trials, interacting with the FDA and the EMA, and essentially positioning this molecule to move forward in clinical development towards a registrational trial. And along the way, as we continue to make progress against these milestones, we were able to go out and continue to raise the capital needed to really be successful. We hired a proper CEO, which is not me. That's not me on the left. That's Jeremy Bender, who's my boss, as well as an expert executive team and a remarkable team of workers. We're now 62 or 63 people as of today, necessary to advance this drug. We were able to raise another $130 million from a larger array of investment firms to continue to fund operations and position ourselves to open larger trials and build the team and move towards commercialization and distribution. We were very lucky to be able to go public in May of 2021, which gives us access to the broader capital markets. That allowed us to finance the in-licensing of additional programs. And really, in the space of about a year, we were able to do quite a bit here summarized in this table. On the business side, not only to finance things and really grow a team of experts around us, both inside of the company and on the board, but on the right, to advance our lead program forward, to get orphan drug designation, breakthrough therapy designation, open up our registrational trial, in-license 2 MEK inhibitors from another company, and continue to make progress running our trials and looking for new programs to make a difference in the lives of children with cancer. So it was a sprint. It's absolutely not finished. This was the sprint to the beginning. And now that we are, a well-capitalized company with a really remarkable team, 2 assets in development and continuing to look, we hope that we can be a sustainable business to continue to try to find and advance assets for childhood cancer, as well as other life-threatening diseases of children. I don't want to just highlight the finance part. That was a lot of fun, without a doubt. But at the end of the day, this is really what matters, which is here's a poster that we published actually at the Connective Tissue Oncology Society meeting just this past fall. When we had this drug, we knew that this drug was likely to work in patients with BRAF wild-type fusion-driven tumors. At least that was our hypothesis in the data that we had generated from low-grade glioma, but we had never tested that hypothesis in tumors outside of the central nervous system. And so when we got a compassionate use request from a doctor with a child with a recurrent spindle cell sarcoma with a novel BRAF gene fusion, we decided, because we could, to provide this drug to this patient on a compassionate use basis. And what you can see here in the bottom left is this child with a posterior mediastinal spindle cell sarcoma that had relapsed after chemotherapy, as well as a prior MEK inhibitor. So a very aggressive tumor, completely unresectable owing to its location. And this child had a remarkable response to tovorafenib to day 101. After 2 cycles, had a complete regression of their tumor. You can't see it anymore on the images on the right. And again, for us, it was proof positive that putting the right drug in the right patient for the right disease could yield remarkable clinical benefits. And it was just probably the most satisfying experience of this whole journey. As I had told the team at the very beginning, if we could make just one patient better, then this whole experience will have been worth it. Of course, we want to do more with that, and the way that the company has progressed has been really nothing short of remarkable. From my perspective, we now have multiple open clinical trials, a trial in relapsed low-grade glioma with BRAF alterations that's open up at 35 sites around the world, where we anticipate having initial data by the end of the first half of this year. We're working on a frontline trial that we hope to open in the first half of this year. And we've, again, keeping to our model of trying to create value for patients as well as investors by extending these drugs to adult oncology, but really based on observations from pediatric oncology, we've now initiated an adult solid tumor trial recruiting patients with BRAF wild-type fusions as well as RAF1 amplifications. And with our new MEK inhibitor, pimasertib, we're taking this combination forward also in adult tumors. And then once we've identified a safe dose for the combination, we'll take that back to pediatric oncology patients. So the whole thing comes full circle. We continue to look for additional programs, again, programs that have evidence of activity in pediatric cancer supported by compelling preclinical or clinical data, an identifiable patient population that we could target for rapid proof of concept, and things that could represent an important investment opportunity. Again, we care about keeping this as a sustainable business. We've looked at many programs, over 100 programs over the past 3 years. We continue to try to find ways to solve for pediatric target-specific molecules, things that would address diseases that only occur in children and not in adults. And as I sort of conclude in the last part of my talk, this remains a challenge for us that we don't know how to solve, but we're being really quite creative about this. And I'll share some ideas on how I think the ecosystem can come together to move the needle for patients where the biology in the pediatric tumor is really unique. So what's next? I think that the experience at day 1 to date has really been quite remarkable proof of concept that you can create a sustainable business that's focused primarily on pediatric cancers. I don't know if you could do the same thing if the company was exclusively focused on pediatric cancer. I certainly wish that we could, and maybe one day that'll be possible. But for today, we continue to start from pediatric cancer, but see the need to find ways of developing drugs to bring benefits to adolescents, young adults, and adults. Again, focused on the biology that drives these tumors, and they're fit for the drugs that we have in our portfolio. But there are additional unmet needs, and we continue to ask ourselves every day how we can serve them. What do we do about pediatric cancers where the population size is small, like subsets of diffuse intrinsic pontine glioma or subsets of neuroblastoma or certain soft tissue sarcomas, particularly where the druggable target isn't relevant in adult cancers. How do you solve for something where the potential treatment addressable market is almost too small to garner external investment? We have to think about that. And I'm not sure that I know what the solution is right now, but I know it's a recalcitrant problem. Another interesting thing that we think about is how do we incentivize either ourselves or others to undertake bespoke drug discovery for targets that are truly unique to pediatric cancer. There's a large array of fusion oncoprotein-driven diseases. Those of you who work in pediatric oncology know about this. We see recurrent fusion oncoproteins in pediatric leukemias, as well as solid tumors such as Ewing sarcoma, alveolar rhabdomyosarcoma, and others. These are difficult fusion proteins to drug because many of the sort of 3' end of these things tend to be transcription factors. So how do we drug things for which, there is no, catalytic domain like there is for a kinase? And what is the role of new medicinal chemistry approaches for pediatric cancer targets? Is there a way to move targeted protein degradation, so-called PROTACs, forward for pediatric cancers faster? What about next generation antibody drug conjugates to target pediatric specific epitopes on cancers, as well as a host of emerging RNA-based therapeutics? And again, these are things that we're very, very interested in trying to explore. They involve finding partner companies to work with us and trying to make the case to them, as I said before, that we can get to faster proof of concept for their technology by focusing on pediatric cancers, which tend to have cleaner biology. What about making clinical development for smaller pediatric oncology indications more efficient? Running large single-arm trials, or even modestly sized single-arm trials is something that we can do, but oftentimes regulators want randomized clinical trial data, and that's very hard to do. So how can we use real-world data and real-world evidence to make clinical development more efficient? This requires the identification of or creation of sufficient data sets, as well as working with regulatory authorities to get an understanding of the bar of quality for real-world data that they'll consider acceptable for the basis of evaluating drugs for approval. Can we use modern clinical trial approaches to make the actual trial process more time and capital efficient by relying on master protocols, even if it means collaborating with other companies or collaborating with companies who have obligations under the Race for Children Act or pediatric investigation plans? And then finally, are there creative business deal structures that would allow a pediatric-focused company to license the pediatric development rights to an adult drug, again, in order to accelerate its development in children? If we build something that we're really good at, which is a clinical team for developing drugs in children, why won't a Merck or a Glaxo or an Amgen or a Genentech partner with us and let us do what we're really good at, which is work they're going to have to do anyway, but we can do it faster and potentially better. So we can't do this alone as day one. The entire oncology ecosystem needs to work together. I believe we need Pediatric Cancer Data Commons and large-scale collaborations as critical infrastructure for drug development. We need continued connectivity between companies like Day One and others in this space, and academic collaborators, governmental agencies, and patient-parent advocacy groups who perform and fund basic research. We need to continue to be more efficient about our clinical trial infrastructure. Nothing drives me crazier than building this massive railroad network of clinical trial sites to accomplish a single trial and then blowing that all up or letting it all decay. We should be running multiple cars down the same railroad tracks, not just a Day One branded car, but we should license those railroad tracks or rent those railroad tracks to other companies. If we set up a expert network for pediatric low-grade glioma, other companies, we should find ways of getting other companies to use that network or use that clinical trial infrastructure. It's better for patients and better for sites. I think we need continued work to prioritize and validate targets for pediatric oncology so that we can find things that give us the reason to believe to make the large investments needed in a drug development program. And we need to continue to have better disease models and as well as a consensus on the role of disease models in target validation and clinical development initiation. I think at some point, we're going to need some type of model that serves as a backstop for diseases that are simply too small to address through a for-profit biotech company. And I do believe that not-for-profit models like Medicines for Kids or potentially public-private partnerships could make a difference here. I think it's just a matter of finding out how. And then finally, and this is probably the most aspirational thing, is thinking beyond developed countries like those within the United States and Europe and Japan, but really how can we go beyond standard clinical trial locations to develop capabilities in low and middle income companies to run faster trials where they have plenty of patients and a dearth of clinical trial opportunities so that we can provide access in clinical trials. But of course, we need to maintain a commitment to provide access beyond clinical trials at launch and really have pediatric cancer drug development be a true global effort. I recruited Mark Kieran, who has been essential in building the clinical trial or building the pediatric oncology program in Cairo, Egypt, to day one. And this is something that he and I talk about frequently. But at the end of the day, I think if we're going to be successful here in truly moving the needle for pediatric oncology patients, it has to be a global effort. So these are just some thoughts. I think I've managed to leave a little bit of time for questions, but I wanted to thank you all for your time and attention and hearing me out. And maybe I'll take a sip of water and stop now.
Sam, that was terrific, and I want to try to squeeze in a couple questions before the top of the hour. So there are two questions about the business model. Hopefully, you can maybe just address them both quickly. One is from Erica Murphy about questioning whether novel or innovative pricing models were considered like value-based pricing as a way to assess the value of PEDS drug development. And then Daniel Morgenstern asks if we could clarify the financial model in terms of achieving returns. Is it mainly about being able to bring to market the drug, or is it more about having a priority voucher that can be resold? So those are related, and maybe you can attack those. And then I want to ask one or two more questions after. So hopefully we can get through a couple.
Yeah, let me take Daniel's question first. Hi, Daniel. So the return on investment needs to really be, the way that we calculate sort of value for programs is through something called net present value, which is basically an economic model based on the clinical development plan, the cost of clinical development, the treatment addressable market, the IP lifespan of the drug. It factors in things like competition and launch dynamics, the time to market penetration. So basically, it's a curve, and you calculate the area under the curve of essentially sales over time. And for many drugs, that'll be in the hundreds of millions of dollars, and for big oncology drugs in adults like Keytruda, it'll be in the many billions of dollars. Priority review vouchers require you getting rare pediatric disease designation, which we were fortunate to get for tovorafenib. But the value of that voucher seems to be sort of in the area of about $90 to $110 million. That's where it's really landed. And at the end of the day, that is not sufficient in and of itself. When we built Day One, we decided not to factor in priority review vouchers into the valuation model, mainly because it's based on legislation that is not permanent and could sunset in the next 4 or 5 years, meaning by the time we get approved, it may not be there. So we actually had to come up with a valuation model that was exclusive of the priority review vouchers. To the first question from Erica about pricing, I'm not the expert on this, and honestly, I can't really comment right now about pricing models for these drugs or for other drugs, mostly because it's just not my area of expertise. But certainly as we move closer to launch and commercialization, pricing becomes something that we need to think about and plan for.
Sam, there's a question from Shweta Bansal, who's an oncologist in India, who's asking about low and middle income countries and trying new drugs in phase 2 or 3 where they're not traditionally tested there, even though 80% of pediatric cancer resides in those countries. Maybe you could, I know you touched upon it at the very end, maybe you could expand on that a little bit.
Yeah, this is something that I think we are very much looking to do. There are pediatric oncology consortia in the United States like PNOC that are working with clinical trial sites in India. We have been constantly talking to people to understand where, when and where countries like China or India or Egypt are going to be ready to run sponsored trials under GCP. There's no doubt that these countries and the academic institutions therein can run clinical trials, but having the infrastructure to run them under GCP and making sure that the data that's generated there is data that's going to stand up to FDA inspection, because that's the bar that we're held to, is the most important part. So, I don't know if we're there yet, certainly for phase 1 trials, but I'm encouraged, again, talking to Mark Kieran about the experience in Egypt, that we're getting there in countries like India and Egypt and other places for later stage trials. So, my hope is that in the future, we will be working with clinical trial sites in India and Egypt and other lower and middle income countries, because absolutely right, a lot of patients, not a lot of competition for trials, and an increasingly expert infrastructure and molecular diagnostics capabilities.
Great. So as we approach the top of the hour, I think, Sam, do you have a minute or two to stay on past the top?
I do. Yeah.
Okay, so people can drop off. Before we drop off, I want to, before we get to the top, I want to thank Caitlin Pike and Catherine Blumhardt for their help in putting this together. And then I want to pitch our next talk, which is on April 19th at noon Central. And Adam Resnick from the Gabriella Miller Kids First Initiative is going to be talking about harnessing collaborative frameworks to build brain tumor networks and to build more infrastructure for studying brain tumors. And Adam is a fantastic speaker, and they've built he's built quite an interesting way to access federated data. So I hope you'll tune in on April 19th at noon to talk to Adam. Sam, there's a question from Kirk Wyatt about something that we all think about, which is that a lot of pediatric cancer drugs are approved by the FDA with a really small number of patients. Sometimes just a couple dozen patients. And so how do we really study drugs for these rare diseases while ensuring that the trials are large enough to have meaningful data?
Yeah, so for rare diseases, the approval is never the end of the story. I think, when you look into things, and I'm curious to know what examples Kirk is referring to, but if you look at the post-marketing commitments, you'll oftentimes see, and
he mentions the larotrectinib, for instance.
Yeah, so if you look at larotrectinib, right, sometimes you get full approval, and I'm trying to remember if larotrectinib I think they got full approval in the relapse setting, but to move it up to frontline, they were required to do additional and substantially bigger trials, and so, the agency considers the amount of data necessary for approval really on a, in pediatric diseases and rare diseases on a case-by-case basis where there's no approved agent and no standard of care. It really is a division review question. The European Medicines Association oftentimes, when you write a pediatric investigation plan, they may be open to, the EMA oftentimes may be open to conditional approval, but once randomized data or frontline data. So, at the end of the day, we think about for pediatric cancer trials, something that's the tip of the spear, a small focus trial in the relapse setting to get initial approval that may be conditional or accelerated approval, that may be full approval, but invariably, in order to generate the return on investment, to bring benefit to patients and to satisfy regulators, we have to think beyond that to frontline trials, oftentimes randomized frontline trials. And then, there's a whole plan for life cycle management as we think about tovorafenib. Our proof of concept trials in pediatric low-grade glioma, but as I've shown you, BRAF wild-type fusions occur in extracranial solid tumors. We've recently amended our frontline or our relapse trial to include extracranial solid tumors, and one could see that as potentially being a development path. So, these things build on each other over time. If there are opportunities that make sense in terms of an investment perspective in clinical development, we'll take them. If regulators believe that they need more data, they'll ask for it. So there's no sort of algorithm for this. It really does tend to be an ongoing dialogue between companies and regulators, and ultimately, trying to figure out what makes financial sense as well.
Maybe we'll just have one or two more. So Daniel Morgenstern has another question about that assuming that all the work you're doing is in-licensed, is proprietary information, is there going to be a mechanism for sharing that information to avoid, again, duplication of this type of effort?
Yeah, I think, Daniel, if you're referring to the things that we learn as we evaluate different compounds, here's what I can tell you. I will look at assets, and if they're not a fit for us, I will try to find whoever has that asset. I'll try to help them find a different home. We were approached by a company in Spain that had a really interesting natural product derivative that they had been working with an academic investigator in the United States to apply it to Ewing sarcoma and other soft tissue sarcomas. And we just couldn't make the math work on it. The program was too early, and there were a number of other issues with it, but I absolutely, without a doubt, got on the phone and called a bunch of other people in my network and said, hey, listen, this doesn't work for us, but this is something that should be followed up on. So, the extent to where we find good science and it doesn't make sense for us, we do try to find other partners. And there are other companies that are not day one that are interested in this space. And I'm always more than happy to continue to breathe life into programs if we can't be the ones to do it.
Thanks, Sam. Let's end on a question from Antonia Palmer, which is near and dear to my heart, which is imagining the clinical trials infrastructure landscape and what it should look like. I've always professed that writing trials in Microsoft Word and using PDFs is really one of the things that's hindering us most from a lot of the automated order generation and test generation and adverse event reporting and all the things that we could do if we just had structure to clinical trials. And we're facing that now developing our Gearbox platform, because matching kids to clinical trials requires this very tedious pulling of the inclusion and exclusion criteria from clinicaltrials.gov. So what do you see as like the future of clinical trials infrastructure that we can where we can harness all modern technology to make things work better?
Well, I mean, look, you and I, Sam, could probably sit on the steps to McCormick Center for another couple of hours again, like we did a number of years ago, and brainstorm ways to do this. Probably the thing that I've been most focused on is within industry, thinking about, as more companies have to do clinical trials to meet either FDA obligations or European obligations, why not find a business model that will allow us to partner with those companies? So when we've set up, I'll give you I'm trying to think of I'll give you I'll try and genericize the example. We set up a program, our relapsed low-grade glioma trial. We've got 35 sites around the world. And when our trial's done, we're probably, I don't see, anytime in the next year, another relapsed low-grade glioma trial that we're necessarily going to sponsor. But I absolutely know of other companies who have now have drugs in development for targets that occur in relapsed low-grade glioma, where those targets have caused them to have an obligation to run a relapsed low-grade glioma trial. So why not find a way to partner with that company and say, either you let us run this trial for you on our, basically we're going to roll your railroad car down the tracks that we built, and for that we'll help you, we'll hitch it to our engine, and we'll charge you, a carriage fee to get it from point A to point B. What that means is we actually, can monetize, if you will, our clinical trial infrastructure. We can recover some of the costs. You, the partner company, don't have to build the thing that we just built, which is very expensive and time consuming. And then the most important thing is that the academic investigators who invested time and effort into getting the trial up and running can use that infrastructure for patients with the same disease, but a different biomarker, and have another treatment option for patients who might not otherwise have a place to go. And you're working with the same team. Things aren't changing again. You don't have to switch CROs. So there are efficiencies that can be built into the system here. It's kind of a master protocol idea, but run by a single company where you invite in other companies to do it. And again, this is something that's a thought. It's not something that we're doing right now, but it's something that, I would love to see going forward. It does take a lot of working, with, how do you make it make sense from a day one perspective for us? And then how do you convince a partner company to trust you to run their trial effectively?
It's got to be carrots and sticks, as we say. So, Sam, this is wonderful. As you say, I could sit here and talk to you all day about this, and it's always fun to catch up. It's really great to hear your origin story for day one, and we're super excited and hope that you'll come back in a year or two and give us an update and tell us about all the great things that you guys are doing. But thank you so much for doing this. It's great for you to take time out of your day to do this, and we're super appreciative, and we'll look forward to hearing more. So thank you.
Thank you for the invitation there, Sam, and thank you everybody for your time.
Okay, thanks everybody. Bye-bye.